Welcome to an introduction to writing philosophy. This lecture will introduce you to the whats, whys, and hows of writing a philosophy paper. We'll talk about what a philosophy paper consists of, why philosophers write, and some of the methods and skills that philosophers use in their work. First, let's begin by asking, what makes a piece of writing philosophical? What does that actually mean? Well, think about if you've ever been to a bookstore or a library, you've probably noticed that different kinds of writing are separated from one another. You have a section for history, one for science fiction, a section for poetry, and so on. And hopefully you also have a section for philosophy. But have you ever wondered exactly how people go about deciding which books should go where? In other words, what actually distinguishes one kind of writing from another? Now, some of these questions may be easier to answer than others. For example, distinguishing a work of history from a science fiction novel is probably not too difficult. Likewise, distinguishing a book of poems from an algebra book is also probably fairly straightforward. But what about philosophy? What actually distinguishes philosophy from other kinds of writing? Well, there are many ways to answer this question. In fact, it's one of the questions that philosophers themselves have been pondering for centuries. But for the purposes of our course, we'll be distinguishing philosophical writing from other kinds in terms of two things. First, the kinds of questions that philosophers raise, and second, the methods that philosophers use to answer them. The kinds of questions that philosophers ask are ones which cannot be answered by empirical inquiry alone. We may call these questions abstract, since they concern the sort of things that fall outside of what we can observe with our senses. Some of the questions that have interested philosophers include: how should concepts like justice, knowledge, or beauty be defined? How should we behave towards one another? What makes something true or false, real or imaginary, good or bad? And philosophers have even sought to clarify the boundaries and aims of other fields, such as history, science, religion, and even philosophy itself. Philosophers probe for answers to these questions beyond those offered by religion, science, the law, or popular opinion. Taking little for granted, philosophers interrogate claims, concepts, and values at their deepest level. But why would they want to do that? Even though philosophers begin their work by investigating abstract concepts, problems, and questions, their concerns are ultimately concrete and practical. The work that philosophers do impacts the way that we think, the way that we act, and the way that we live our lives. Take the concept of justice, for example. Without a clear conception of what justice really means, how can we determine whether or not someone has acted unjustly? What reasons would we have for punishing someone if we can't even explain clearly what made their action wrong? Even though the question, what is justice, may appear abstract, it concerns a variety of practical, real-world issues. For example, what sorts of laws should we pass, and how should we enforce them? In fact, many of the questions that philosophers focus on arise not from philosophy itself, but from the problems that we encounter in our own lives. And for more on this, you can see my lecture, Philosophy Begins With You, where I talk about that topic specifically. The point is this: people read philosophy to help them better understand the nature of these problems and to navigate them more effectively. And since philosophy has the potential to change the way that people think and improve the way that people live, it's important for philosophers to share their work with others. And they do this through their writing. In their work, philosophers present their position on a particular topic, defend their position on that topic, and ultimately end up making a contribution to a broader conversation. So how do we actually go about doing that? Well, there are a few important elements that a philosophy paper will include. These are a topic, which is an area of philosophy, an ongoing debate, a question that needs to be answered, or a problem that needs to be solved. A thesis, which is the position that you take on an issue, the answer you give to a question, the solution you propose to a problem. And finally, an argument, a series of claims intended to support your position, to demonstrate why the reader should accept your answer to the question, your solution to the problem. We'll cover each of these elements of a philosophy paper in future lessons in this course. You'll have a lesson on choosing a topic, crafting a thesis statement, and developing an argument. Now that we know the basic ingredients for a philosophy paper, let's take a look at how philosophers actually go about writing one. Just like any other profession, philosophers use certain tools to get their work done. We'll cover these in more detail in our lessons on argumentation, but for now, let's get acquainted with the philosopher's toolbox. Some of the tools that philosophers use in their writing include claims. These are statements that are true or false and can be argued for or against. Evidence, which is support for your claims, reasons to think that a claim is true. And logic. Logic is connecting your claims to the support that you give for them. It's showing that the inferences you've drawn from your evidence actually make sense. Besides these tools, there are a few important skills that philosophical writing requires of us. Some of these you may have already demonstrated in the past, especially if you've read or written about philosophy before, while others you may be less familiar with. The good thing about writing philosophy is it gives you an opportunity to do both, to sharpen the skills you already have and to develop new ones. Writing a work of philosophy requires an ability to think critically, to reason carefully, and it also requires a commitment to intellectual courage. Let's go through what each of these actually mean. Thinking critically about a concept, a claim, or a divisive issue involves asking questions like these. Is there a lack of clarity? Is there a lack of consistency? Are there reasons to doubt this? Critical thinking uncovers problems like conceptual vagueness, contradictory claims, and weak arguments. Reasoning carefully involves educating yourself about your topic, understanding the opposing view, forming a position of your own, and developing a valid argument in support of your view. Careful reasoning helps us to discover solutions to the problems outlined previously, in others' thinking, as well as in our own. Finally, a commitment to intellectual courage involves pushing through obstacles, keeping an open mind, thinking about the impact of your work, and pursuing the strongest argument. Intellectual courage is a virtue. It's a mindset that philosophy requires, but it's also one that philosophy develops. That's really important to keep in mind, is that all of these skills, all of these tools that we're talking about, philosophy requires them of us, but through practicing, through writing more and more, every time we try and apply these skills and use these tools, we get better at them. So far, we've gone over the purposes of writing philosophy, the elements of a philosophy paper, and the methods and skills that philosophers use in their writing. Now, all of that sounds like a lot of work, and I'll be honest, it is, but it's also worth it, and I want to talk about why. Writing a work of philosophy gives you an opportunity to develop your ideas and share them with others. Through your writing, you can change the way that people think about a complex issue. You can highlight problems that others have not noticed and point the way towards solutions that haven't been considered. Writing philosophy can also improve the way that you think. It can help you think more clearly and write more clearly in other areas of your life. In fact, one of the chief values of writing philosophy is that you can take the skills you learn here and apply them to virtually any other fields you could think of. All of the skills that philosophy calls for, outlined previously, are also skills that philosophy itself will sharpen and develop every time you use them. Philosophy investigates some of the most essential questions that human beings think about and implicates some of the most important aspects of our lives. It is both a right and a responsibility for us to think as deeply and as clearly about them as we can. We owe that to others, and we owe it to ourselves. And my hope is that this course will help you to do that.